Mick Jagger, the irrepressible frontman of the Rolling Stones, has finally lifted the curtain on what really went down in the 1960s, a decade of chaos, creativity, excess, and cultural upheaval, sharing candid insights about the wild years when the Stones were not just a band but a lightning rod for rebellion, style, and rock and roll itself. Because while history often romanticizes the era as a golden age of music and youthful freedom, Jagger is quick to remind fans that it was also a time of relentless pressure, personal excess, and public scrutiny, a period where every performance, every interview, and every appearance was dissected by fans, critics, and the media, shaping the band's identity and influencing the trajectory of rock music forever. And he speaks openly about how fame arrived almost overnight in the early 60s, with the Rolling Stones forming in 1962 and quickly becoming the face of Britain's answer to the Beatles, not just for their music but for their attitude, swagger, and unapologetic edge, noting that while they shared the spotlight with other British bands, the Stones cultivated a dangerous, rebellious persona that made them both adored and vilified. And Jagger reflects on the paradox of that fame, where adoration and criticism were inseparable, creating a feedback loop that fueled both creativity and controversy, because every headline mattered, every scandal became part of the myth, and every performance carried the weight of expectation, both from their growing fan base and from a society that struggled to understand rock and roll's raw energy. And he recalls the early tours across Britain and Europe, the grueling schedule that pushed the band to their physical and emotional limits, the moments backstage when exhaustion, tension, and adrenaline collided, creating both conflict and inspiration. And Jagger admits that behind the glamour, there were real struggles with authority, management, and each other, as the band learned to navigate a music industry that was still figuring out how to handle rock stars who refused to conform. And he details how the 60s were also a time of experimentation with drugs, fashion, and lifestyle, which, while contributing to the Stones' mythos, also created a volatile environment that tested friendships and personal resilience. And he is candid about how the band's notorious excesses, from legendary parties to run-ins with the law, were not simply for show but a reflection of a generation pushing boundaries and redefining what it meant to live freely. And yet, amidst the chaos, Jagger stresses that music was always the core, the reason the band existed, noting how the Stones were driven by rhythm, blues, and an obsession with finding their own voice, blending American influences with their own British sensibility, creating a sound that was at once primal, sophisticated, and entirely their own. And he remembers the pivotal moments of the decade, from the release of their early singles like I Can't Get No Satisfaction and Paint It Black, to their iconic albums like Aftermath and Between the Buttons, tracks that not only defined the Stones but captured the zeitgeist of a decade marked by social change, sexual liberation, and political unrest. And Jagger is unflinching in acknowledging the internal dynamics of the band, noting that creative disagreements, personal rivalries, and clashing egos were constant, because each member, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, Charlie Watts, Bill Wyman, and himself, brought both genius and volatility to the table. And he reflects on how those tensions fueled some of their best music while also threatening to derail the group entirely. And he recounts the darker moments, including Jones' struggles with addiction, the tragic accidents and losses that touched the band, and the constant media scrutiny that left little room for privacy or reflection, explaining that surviving and thriving in that environment required not just talent but resilience, cunning, and an almost stubborn refusal to be defined by public opinion. And he shares how the Stones' image as the bad boys of rock was cultivated both organically and strategically, with Mick himself often acting as the public face, navigating interviews, television appearances, and public controversies with charisma and careful calculation, because he understood that perception mattered as much as music, that creating a mythos could amplify their cultural impact, and that controlling their narrative, even when chaotic, was crucial. And he reflects on the legendary tours of the 60s, including the U.S. invasions where the Stones encountered new audiences, racial dynamics, and the cultural revolution of America, noting that these experiences broadened their musical horizons, informed their songwriting, and deepened their understanding of the world, while also exposing them to the pressures of international fame. And Jagger recalls the camaraderie and friction of those tours, the long nights, the endless performances, and the personal sacrifices made for the sake of art and survival. And he is remarkably candid about the role of drugs in shaping the decade, explaining that experimentation was both a creative stimulant and a destructive force, impacting decisions, relationships, and even the band's longevity. But he balances that honesty with acknowledgement that the music that emerged from that experimentation resonated with millions, capturing emotions and experiences that were otherwise unspoken. And he emphasizes that the Stones' evolution in the 60s was as much about personal growth as musical exploration, with each album reflecting both artistic ambition and the turbulence of life in real time. and he highlights the influence of socio-political events, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the counterculture revolution, on their songwriting, noting that the Stones were both participants in and commentators on a rapidly changing world, using their music to challenge norms, provoke thought, and give voice to a restless generation, and he reflects on how the 1960s forged the band's identity, established their legacy, and set a template for rock music as a vehicle for both rebellion and expression, all while acknowledging that the era was unsustainable, that the intensity of creation, performance, and public scrutiny inevitably led to burnout, interpersonal conflict, and tragedy, and he recalls how the pressures of the industry, combined with personal demons and the relentless pace of success, eventually created cracks that foreshadowed future struggles, and yet, even with those challenges, Jagger maintains that the 60s were a golden period of artistic possibility, social impact, and personal discovery, because every risk taken, every experiment, and every misstep contributed to the band's evolution and cultural imprint, shaping not just their music but the broader landscape of rock and roll, and he is clear that while myths abound about the Stones' wild behavior, the reality was far more complex, a mixture of genius, friendship, rivalry, excess, and artistry, and he explains that understanding that complexity is essential to truly appreciating what the band achieved, because the stories of those years are not just about drugs, sex, and scandal, but about creativity under pressure, the forging of identity, and the emergence of a cultural phenomenon that has endured for decades, and he reflects on his own role as a frontman, noting that the public often misunderstands the delicate balance between performance, persona, and personal life, and how projecting confidence, charisma, and rebelliousness on stage sometimes masked vulnerability, insecurity, and the enormous responsibility he felt toward his bandmates, the fans, and the music itself, and Jagger acknowledges that the 60s created legends out of ordinary men, transforming them into icons, and that transformation carried both privilege and burden, a paradox that shaped the trajectory of every member, and he is refreshingly honest about mistakes, regrets, and the lessons learned, emphasizing that without the mistakes, the growth, and the tension, the music would not have been the same, because the Stones' sound, style, and reputation were inseparable from their lived experience, their struggles, and their resilience, and he concludes that the decade of the 60s was not just about music, fashion, or fame, but about survival, creativity, and identity, a whirlwind that defined the band, influenced global culture, and left an indelible mark on history, while teaching enduring lessons about the cost of greatness, the value of authenticity, and the power of rock and roll to reflect, challenge, and transform society. And as Mick Jagger reflects today, decades later, he sees the 60s as both a time of personal reckoning and unparalleled opportunity, a period that forged the character, vision, and enduring legacy of the Rolling Stones, reminding us that behind the glamour, controversy, and myth, there was always the music, the drive, and the relentless pursuit of artistic truth, because understanding the real story of the 60s means acknowledging not just the wild nights and historic concerts, but the human experience, the ambition, mistakes, triumphs, and failures that made the Rolling Stones not just a band but a symbol of an era, a story Mick Jagger now tells with candor, humor, and reflection, revealing that the myth of the 60s, while often exaggerated, is rooted in real experiences that shaped music history, and that the legend of the Rolling Stones endures because it captures the full spectrum of life, creativity, and rebellion that defined a generation and continues to inspire countless musicians and fans around the world, a reminder that behind the music, behind the iconography, and behind the myth, there were real people navigating extraordinary times, making choices, and creating art that still resonates more than half a century later.